When we begin to speak of desire, repression, and the curious repetitions that dominate the lives of human beings, we are not merely speaking of habits. We are speaking of a compulsion born from the depths of the psyche. From that obscure domain, we have come to call the unconscious. It is the place where every forbidden wish, every unsatisfied longing, every memory, too painful to acknowledge, continues to live in a kind of silent persistence. What we call falling back into old patterns is not a failure of willpower, as the moralist might suggest, but rather a triumph of the unconscious over consciousness, a return of what was once repressed, dressed in new forms, seeking expression once again. The human being is not a creature of full self-knowledge. He is, rather, a divided being. His consciousness, that fragile light by which he perceives himself as rational and moral, rests upon a vast, unseen reservoir of drives, instincts, and memories. This hidden part of him is what I have long described as the unconscious. Within it, the primitive desires of childhood, the libidinal energies of the ID, and the punitive demands of the superego wage an eternal war. While the ego, that poor mediator, attempts to maintain a fragile balance between chaos and civilization, when one repeats the same destructive pattern again and again, choosing similar lovers, sabotaging one's success, retreating into familiar failures, what is being repeated is not an accident but an unconscious script. It is a dramatization of repressed content, the psyche's way of expressing what consciousness refuses to face. It is often said that the past haunts us, but that is a poetic simplification. The truth is more disturbing. The past does not haunt us, it lives within us. The repressed is not dead, it is merely buried alive. And like all living things, it seeks movement, expression, and release. Every symptom, every dream, every nervous tic or irrational decision is an encoded message from this inner world, a symbolic language in which the unconscious communicates with the conscious mind. Thus, when you find yourself once again entangled in an unhealthy relationship or drawn toward behaviors that humiliate you, it is not coincidence. It is repetition, a return of the repressed, a psychological compulsion to reenact an unresolved conflict under the illusion of novelty. In my clinical experience, I have often encountered individuals who, despite the most sincere resolutions, return again and again to what injures them. A woman, abandoned by her father, seeks the affection of men who cannot stay. A man humiliated in childhood by a cold mother marries a woman whose indifference wounds him anew. Another, raised in a home where affection was conditional, becomes a perfectionist whose entire existence revolves around earning approval that never truly arrives. When we look deeply, we discover that these are not random choices. They are repetitions of an ancient pattern, the reanimation of forgotten pain under the guise of present circumstance. The unconscious is conservative. It clings to what is familiar, even when it is destructive, because repetition gives it a strange sense of mastery. What cannot be resolved in reality will be reenacted in fantasy and behavior, again and again, until the truth is made conscious. Repression is the cornerstone of the civilized mind. To live in society, man must renounce many of his instinctual gratifications. The infant, once omnipotent and unrestrained, learns to delay pleasure, to submit to authority, to restrain aggression, to sublimate libido into socially acceptable forms, art, work, religion. Yet, repression does not erase desire, it merely hides it. and every repressed desire exerts a constant pressure upon the ego. It is as if the unconscious were an ancient volcano, long dormant, yet trembling beneath the surface, seeking cracks through which it may erupt. The dream, the slip of the tongue, the sudden impulse, these are its tremors. When the ego grows weak, when fatigue or emotion lower its defenses, the repressed returns with all the vigor of its original passion. It is in dreams that we see this mechanism most clearly. The dream is the royal road to the unconscious, for it is there that desire, freed from the censorship of the ego, reveals itself, though not directly. The dream disguised desire in symbols, distortions, and substitutions, precisely to protect the dreamer from conscious awareness of what would be too painful or shameful to confront. A patient once dreamt of walking through a corridor of mirrors, each reflecting a distorted image of himself, until he found one mirror that showed him as a child holding a knife. The conscious mind interpreted this as nonsense. Yet under analysis, it revealed itself as the expression of repressed hostility toward his father, a hostility born in childhood, suppressed by guilt, yet reappearing nightly in dreams. His recurring conflicts with authority in adulthood were but repetitions of this same unresolved wish. The dream was not random. It was a symbolic enactment of a repressed impulse that shaped his entire destiny. We deceive ourselves when we imagine that the mind is unified. What we call self is a temporary truce between warring factions. The ego is but the diplomat between the id, the reservoir of instinctual drives, and the superego, the internalized voice of parental and social authority. The id knows only desire. It seeks satisfaction, pleasure, the discharge of tension. The superego knows only prohibition. It demands restraint, morality, conformity. The ego, caught between these tyrants, is condemned to endless compromise. It must satisfy desire without guilt and obey morality without self-destruction. Yet this balance is precarious, and when repression becomes too rigid, desire finds indirect means of expression through neurosis, symptom formation, or repetition. Thus, every old pattern is a rebellion of the id against the tyranny of the superego, and every act of self-sabotage is the disguised victory of repressed desire over conscious intent. There exists, within every individual, an unspoken nostalgia for the primitive freedom of instinct. Civilization demands that we repress this longing, and yet it never fully succeeds. The very institutions that sustain society, religion, art, love, are themselves sublimations of repressed desire. The lover's devotion, the artist's creation, the mystic's ecstasy, these are transformations of the same libido that once sought only immediate gratification. Sublimation is the noblest outcome of repression. It allows instinct to find expression without destroying the social order. But when repression is excessive, when desire is denied, even the possibility of symbolic expression, the psyche revolts. The energy that could have become creation becomes destruction. Eros turns into thanatos. The life instinct becomes the death drive. The compulsion to repeat painful experiences is one of the clearest manifestations of this death instinct, a striving, paradoxically, toward the inanimate, toward the cessation of inner conflict through the return to an earlier, pre-conscious state. To understand why one returns to old patterns, we must look beyond the surface of behavior to the hidden satisfaction it conceals. Every repetition, however painful, contains an unconscious pleasure, a gratification of a wish that consciousness cannot accept. The woman who repeatedly falls for unfaithful men may unconsciously seek confirmation of a childhood belief that she is unworthy of loyalty. The man who ruins his own success may unconsciously punish himself for forbidden ambitions. The neurotic symptom, though consciously distressing, serves the unconscious as a disguised fulfillment of desire. This is the paradox of repression. What consciousness calls suffering, the unconscious calls satisfaction. Hence, the cure cannot be achieved by willpower alone, but by insight, by bringing the repressed content into awareness, allowing the ego to recognize and integrate what it had once denied. The therapeutic process, then, is not merely an intellectual exercise. It is an act of courage. To recall the repressed is to relive the pain, to face the forbidden wishes of childhood without the armor of denial. The patient who lies upon the couch and begins to speak, to allow thoughts to flow freely, without censorship, engages in what I have called free association. Through this process, the unconscious speaks in fragments, slips, contradictions, and pauses. What seems trivial or absurd often conceals the kernel of truth. The analyst, listening with what I have described as evenly suspended attention, detects the hidden connections between words, gestures, and silences. In time, the patient begins to see the pattern, the secret logic of their repetitions, and with this awareness comes the possibility of change. For what is made conscious loses its power to compel. The symptom dissolves when its meaning is understood. But make no mistake, the unconscious does not surrender easily. It resists analysis, defends its secrets through what I have called resistance. The patient forgets appointments, grows bored, insists that nothing important comes to mind. These are not coincidences. They are expressions of repression's tenacity. The ego fears the return of what it once buried. For to acknowledge repressed desire is to threaten the entire structure of its identity. The analytic process is therefore a struggle not between doctor and patient, but between the patient's desire for truth and their fear of it. Every resistance conceals a forbidden wish. Every silence hides a memory that consciousness cannot yet bear to face. Yet only by traversing this darkness can one be liberated from it. I recall a patient, a successful man of letters, who came to me complaining of creative paralysis. He could no longer write. Every attempt ended in self-disgust. He spoke of ambition as if it were a disease, of pleasure as if it were sin. Under analysis, it emerged that in childhood, he had been humiliated by a father who envied his intelligence. Each success, as an adult, reawakened that repressed conflict, the wish to surpass the father, forbidden by guilt. Thus, he sabotaged his own achievements to preserve the illusion of filial loyalty. His paralysis was not laziness, it was obedience. Obedience to a dead father internalized as superego. Only when he could confront this unconscious loyalty, could permit himself to feel both love and anger, did the symptom lose its function. He wrote again, not because I cured him, but because he dared to reclaim his repressed desire as his own. Désir, repression, repetition. These are not diseases to be eradicated, but fundamental laws of psychic life. Man is condemned to conflict because he is torn between instinct and civilization, between pleasure and prohibition. His tragedy is not that he desires, but that he must conceal his desire from himself. The unconscious does not care for morality. It seeks expression. The task of analysis is to translate its language, to make the invisible visible. Only then can the individual cease to be the puppet of his own unconscious drama and become, at last, the author of it. The phenomenon of repetition, compulsion, cannot be explained merely as habit. It is the manifestation of a force deeper and older than reason. Beneath the rational ego lies an unrelenting drive, a primordial instinct that seeks not pleasure, but resolution through recurrence. It is the psyche's attempt to master what once overwhelmed it, to reenact trauma in the hope of finally controlling it. Yet, tragically, the subject remains bound to the repetition, unable to recognize its origin. The patient believes himself free, yet every choice is a repetition disguised as decision. He falls in love with the same type of person, fails in the same manner, and suffers the same disappointments, as though driven by a daemon whispering the script of his own undoing. This compulsion to repeat is bound to the death instinct, or thanatos, that hidden counterpart to eros. The life force, the organism, in its deepest layers, yearns for the inorganic state from which it came. The return to sameness, to the familiar pain, is a symbolic movement towards psychic stasis, an unconscious effort to annul the tension of existence. The neurotic, endlessly reliving his wounds, is both victim and executioner of his own psyche. Eros strives for connection, creation, union. Thanatos pulls toward dissolution, destruction, and the quiet of non-being. Within every human act, both forces are at work. Even love, in its most obsessive form, conceals the shadow of destruction, the wish to possess, to merge, to annihilate the boundary between self and other. Every desire carries within it the seed of its own death. Dreams reveal this dialectic in their most naked form. The dream does not lie. It only speaks in symbols, for direct truth would terrify the waking mind. The dream work, as I have called it, transforms forbidden wishes into acceptable disguises. It employs condensation, displacement, and symbolization to conceal the latent content beneath a manifest narrative. Consider a patient who dreams of climbing an endless staircase, always ascending, yet never reaching the top. Consciously, he reports anxiety, exhaustion, futility, but analysis uncovers the latent wish, a sexual impulse, a desire for mastery, for elevation over the father figure. The staircase is the symbol of ambition and rivalry, the endless ascent, the repression of forbidden desire. His waking frustration at never getting anywhere mirrors the repressed wish for triumph that cannot be acknowledged. Thus, the dream preserves both the satisfaction and the denial of the wish, the perfect compromise between id and superego. We must understand that repression is not an act once completed, but an ongoing process. It is maintained through the constant vigilance of the ego, a ceaseless censorship of the inner world. The ego, fearing the chaos of the unconscious, builds defenses denial, projection, rationalization, reaction formation. Each defense mechanism has its purpose, yet all exact a price. The more rigid the defense is, the more distorted the personality becomes. A man who represses aggression becomes excessively polite. A woman who denies desire becomes sanctimoniously pure. The more they succeed in banishing the forbidden impulse from awareness, the more it returns through symptoms, slips, and substitutions. The repressed does not vanish, it transforms. It hides beneath the mask of virtue, emerging only when the mask cracks. In analysis, this struggle takes on a vivid form through what we call transference. The patient, in speaking to the analyst, inevitably reenacts the emotional patterns of his past. He transfers onto the analyst the feelings once directed toward his parents' love, hatred, dependence, rebellion. This transference is not an obstacle, but the very material of analysis. Through it, the unconscious reveals itself. The patient who fears abandonment will perceive the analyst as distant. The one who longs for approval will imagine himself constantly judged. Each distortion of perception is a projection of repressed affect. The analyst becomes the screen upon which the patient's inner theater is played out. And in this reenactment lies the possibility of transformation. For the analyst, by remaining neutral, allows the patient to see the projection for what it is, a repetition of the past within the present. But there is also countertransference, the analyst's own unconscious response to the patient's material. No analyst is free of desire, of memory, of the repressed. The unconscious of the doctor responds to that of the patient. Analysis is a dialogue between two depths, not the instruction of one intellect by another. Therefore, the analyst must analyze himself, lest his own repressions distort his understanding. In the analytic room, two unconscious minds converse in symbols while their egos attempt to interpret the meaning. The task is delicate, for we are not merely curing illness, but unraveling the knot of being itself. The return of the repressed is most dramatically visible in dreams and neuroses, but it also shapes art, religion, and morality. The myths of gods and demons are externalizations of inner conflicts. The serpent in the garden, the fall from grace, the forbidden fruit, these are projections of the primal conflict between desire and prohibition. In every civilization, the sacred and the taboo mirror one another. That which is most forbidden is also most fascinating. For repression and desire are two sides of the same coin. The Puritan, who condemns pleasure, secretly worships it. The moral crusader is often possessed by the very impulse he seeks to destroy. This is why humanity cannot escape its own symbols, because they are not inventions of imagination, but expressions of the collective unconscious conflict between Eros and Thanatos, between the longing to live and the longing to return to nothingness. One must not mistake psychoanalysis for a doctrine of pessimism. To expose the repressed is not to glorify the instinct, but to restore freedom to the psyche. Repression narrows the field of consciousness. It imprisons vitality within symptoms. To analyze is to widen that field, to bring shadow into light, to allow the ego to reconcile rather than deny. The healthy individual is not one who has no instincts, but one who can recognize and channel them without being enslaved. Civilization itself is founded upon repression. Without it, there would be no art, no order, no progress. But when repression becomes excessive, civilization turns neurotic. The individual becomes alienated from his instincts, and the society that demands this renunciation begins to disintegrate under its own moral weight. It is often said that man is rational, yet the study of the unconscious has revealed otherwise. Rationality is but a thin crust floating upon an ocean of irrational impulses. The ego prides itself on logic, yet its reasoning is often a post hoc justification of desires it does not understand. A man may claim to act from principle, but beneath the principle lies an instinctual wish for power, for love, for security. The unconscious uses reason as camouflage, dressing desire in the garments of virtue. Thus, the more a man insists upon his purity of motive, the more one must suspect repression at work. The unconscious is cunning. It can deceive the very self that harbors it. Let me speak of language, for in it the unconscious betrays itself. The slip of the tongue, the forgotten name, the misplaced object, all are acts of communication from the repressed. A woman, intending to say, "I am happy for you," says instead, "I am jealous of you." The conscious mind blushes, excuses itself as a mistake, but the unconscious has spoken truth. Similarly, the man who forgets to send a letter he dreads writing is not forgetful but resistant. Every error conceals intention. Every accident has meaning. The psyche is not careless. It is expressive. In dreams, in yogas, in art, the unconscious finds its voice. To listen to these fragments is to trace the hidden logic of repression, to uncover the desire that seeks expression beneath the mask of accident. If you observe a child, you will see the origins of this drama in miniature. The child desires without shame, loves and hates with equal intensity, and speaks its impulses openly. Civilization educates the child into repression. Do not touch. Do not say. Be good. Thus begins the internalization of authority, the birth of the superego. The forbidden becomes internal law. The parent becomes voice of conscience. And the once unified instinctual being becomes divided against itself. The adult spends the rest of his life negotiating between the demands of this internalized parent and the still living child within. When he repeats old patterns, it is often the child, still seeking reconciliation, who acts through him. The man who seeks harsh partners is looking for the stern father's approval. The woman who fears affection recalls the mother's withdrawal. Analysis, therefore, is the art of reuniting the adult with the child, not by regression, but by understanding. I have said elsewhere that the goal of analysis is to make the unconscious conscious. And where ID was, ego shall be. But this is not a call to extinguish instinct. The id is not the enemy. It is the source of vitality itself. Without desire, there is no movement, no creation. The task is not to destroy the idu, but to reconcile it with reality. The mature ego is one that can bear to know its own darkness without collapsing into it. The neurotic cannot do this. He must deny, repress, project. The healthy individual can see his impulses clearly, recognize them as his own, and choose their expression with awareness. Freedom is not the absence of desire. It is the capacity to live with desire consciously. The modern man believes himself free because he no longer believes in demons. Yet he remains possessed, not by spirits, but by his own unconscious. His technology grows, but his knowledge of himself diminishes. He mistakes distraction for happiness and calls repression virtue. He repeats, endlessly, the same emotional patterns under new disguises in love, in politics, in war. What he calls progress is often repetition in more elaborate forms. Until he confronts the unconscious, humanity will continue to act out its repressed conflicts on the stage of history. The analyst's task, then, is not merely therapeutic. It is moral in the deepest sense. To bring consciousness to repression is to restore to man the knowledge of his divided nature. It demands honesty of a kind few can bear the willingness to look within and see not an angel, but an animal yearning for love and destruction alike. To know oneself truly is to accept that within the same heart dwell eros and thanatos, tenderness and cruelty, creation and ruin. To repress one is to empower the other. Only through awareness can one live without being consumed by either. When I examine the human soul, I find within it a strange contradiction, a longing for liberation entwined with a deep compulsion towards suffering. It is as though the psyche were divided between two gods. One, demanding pleasure and expansion. The other, craving punishment and restraint. This paradox lies at the very heart of repetition and repression. The ego, in its ceaseless effort to maintain moral integrity, often allies itself with the superego, that stern internal authority born from the introjection of parental figures. The result is the formation of guilt, the silent overseer of our psychic lives. Guilt transforms désir into sin, impulse into shame, and every forbidden wish into an inner crime. The individual thus lives under a perpetual sentence of self-punishment, condemned by the very authority he carries within. You see, repression does not simply banish desire from consciousness, it binds it to guilt. What was once a source of pleasure becomes a source of suffering. Yet the unconscious, ever faithful to its drives, continues to seek expression. The conflict produces symptoms, compulsions, anxieties, perversions, dreams of disaster. The ego suffers, but the suffering itself fulfills an unconscious wish, the wish for expiation. One might say that the neurotic is addicted to his own guilt, for through it he maintains a semblance of moral purity. The punishment he inflicts upon himself is the disguise through which he continues to gratify the forbidden desire. The one who repeatedly fails, who continually chooses humiliation, is often enacting an unconscious drama of atonement, a ritual of purification through pain. Consider, for instance, the man who sabotages every relationship just as it begins to deepen. Consciously, he laments his loneliness, his inability to trust, but beneath this lament lies an unconscious conviction that he does not deserve love. This conviction originates in childhood, in the guilt of forbidden wishes, perhaps jealousy toward a sibling, or hostility toward a parent. The child represses the wish but retains the guilt. As an adult, he recreates situations that confirm this guilt, as though to justify it retroactively. His loneliness is not mere misfortune. It is the symbolic punishment for desires he once deemed unacceptable. Thus, repetition serves a dual purpose. It allows the repressed desire to express itself in disguised form, and it simultaneously satisfies the demand of the superego for penance. In analysis, one often encounters this mechanism in dreams. The dream of failure, of falling, of being late, of public exposure, all are dramatizations of guilt. The dreamer's ego is punished symbolically for unconscious wishes that remain unacknowledged. A woman dreams she is on trial before a faceless court. She cannot remember her crime, yet she feels the weight of accusation. The dream work disguises the wish. In waking life, she experiences resentment toward her husband's success. A resentment she deems shameful. Unable to own this envy, she transforms it into guilt. The dream supplies the punishment that consciousness demands, and so the psychic equilibrium is restored. The punishment, though painful, preserves the illusion of innocence. The mechanism of repression thus operates through distortion not only of thought but of perception itself. The repressed desire, forbidden entry into awareness, returns through projection. The individual attributes to others what he cannot accept within himself. The jealous man accuses his wife of infidelity because he harbors unconscious desires for others. The moralist condemns impurity because he fears his own impulses. In this way, the world becomes a mirror of the unconscious, reflecting back to the ego its own disowned content. The more violently one rejects a quality in another, the more certain it is that one carries it within. This projection is not deliberate hypocrisy, but a defense, a desperate effort by the ego to maintain its self-image. Yet it is precisely this mechanism that sustains conflict between individuals and nations alike. For what is repressed in the self is externalized as evil in the other. The dream, the symptom, and the projection. These are the languages of the unconscious. They are not random phenomena, but the expression of a coherent logic. Though one alien to conscious reason, the unconscious knows nothing of time or negation. To it, all desires coexist, unrestrained by chronology or morality. The wish that was repressed in childhood retains its full intensity in adulthood. It does not age. It only disguises itself. This is why so many of our adult behaviors are infantile in origin. They are the repetition of childhood impulses under the illusion of maturity. The businessman's obsession with conquest, the artist's longing for admiration, the devotee's submission to divine authority, all are transformations of the same early experiences of love, rivalry, and dependency. Civilization may refine the form, but the essence remains. The psychoanalytic method seeks to uncover this continuity, to trace the thread of present suffering back to its origin in the infantile past. Each association, each hesitation, is a clue in the detective work of the mind. The analyst listens not only to what is said, but to how it is said, to the tone, the rhythm, the pauses. The unconscious does not speak directly. It insinuates itself through gaps and contradictions. When a patient insists too vehemently that he feels nothing toward a person or event, one must suspect repression. The absence of affect is often the surest sign of its existence. The goal is not to impose interpretation, but to allow the repressed material to emerge through the patient's own associations. For only what is discovered by the patient himself can be truly integrated into consciousness. There are moments in analysis when the resistance grows so strong that words fail. The patient becomes silent, confused, hostile. It is as though he stands before the threshold of forbidden knowledge and dares not enter. In such moments, transference intensifies. The analyst becomes the embodiment of the repressed figure, the punitive father, the seductive mother, the rival sibling. The emotional storm that follows is not regression, but revelation. What was once felt in childhood is lived again in the analytic room, where it may finally be understood, rather than repeated. This is the essence of the working through process, the transformation of unconscious repetition into conscious insight. But there is a deeper layer still, the unconscious wish, not merely to repeat, but to undo time itself. The death drive, thanatos, is not satisfied with symbolic return. It seeks literal dissolution. Beneath every compulsion lies a nostalgia for the absolute peace of non-existence. This is why some individuals, when faced with happiness, grow restless and self-destructive. Pleasure threatens the psychic equilibrium by reducing tension too rapidly. It reminds the unconscious of the final release, death. Thus, the same instinct that drives life also pulls it toward extinction. The gambler who risks everything, the addict who seeks oblivion, the lover who longs to merge utterly with the beloved all, are expressions of the death drive, masked by eros. The boundary between desire and destruction is as thin as the veil between dream and reality. In my later reflections, I came to see that civilization itself participates in this same dynamic. Society demands repression in order to function. Yet, the accumulated repression breeds aggression. The instinctual renunciations required for order generate resentment against the very civilization they sustain. The individual, alienated from his instincts, becomes both beneficiary and victim of culture. The neurosis of the individual mirrors the neurosis of society. Wars, persecutions, and moral panics are but collective symptoms, the projection of repressed desires onto the world stage. Humanity, in its endless striving for purity, enacts its own unconscious conflict between eros and thanatos, creation and destruction, life and death. Yet within this tragic structure lies the possibility of transformation. For if repression bends, consciousness liberates. To bring a desire into awareness is not to indulge it blindly, but to acknowledge its existence. The unconscious loses its tyranny when its contents are faced without judgment. The patient who can say, "Yes, I desired this. I hated this. I feared this," begins to dissolve the chain of repetition. The energy once trapped in repression becomes available for creative work, for love that is not compulsion but choice. The act of recognition transforms the destructive into the constructive. The same libido that once produced symptoms becomes the source of art, wisdom, and compassion. Let us not imagine, however, that consciousness can ever be complete. The unconscious is not a region to be conquered, but a dimension of being that will always exceed our comprehension. There is no final victory over repression, only an ongoing dialogue between the known and the unknown. The task of psychoanalysis is not to make man transparent to himself, but to teach him humility before the mystery of his own nature. The unconscious is the dark twin of reason, the shadow without which consciousness cannot exist. To deny it is to live as a fragment. To acknowledge it is to live as a whole. I recall the words of a patient who, after months of resistance, finally wept and said, "I see now that I have been both the jailer and the prisoner." This realization is the turning point of analysis. It is not the discovery of some new fact, but the recognition that the forces that enslaved him were his own. The chains were internal, forged by repression and maintained by guilt. In seeing this, he no longer needed to repeat the old pattern, for the unconscious compulsion had become a conscious choice. He could love without reenacting loss, succeed without inviting punishment, live without seeking death. Such moments are rare, for they demand a courage that few possess, the courage to see one's own desire without disguise. Human freedom, therefore, is not the absence of instinct, but the reconciliation with it. To be free is to act from awareness, not from compulsion. The neurotic is driven by forces he does not understand. The healthy mind directs those same forces toward creative ends. The libido that once produced anxiety becomes, through sublimation, the source of culture and art. The same energy that fuels obsession can, when recognized, become devotion. The instinct for destruction, when acknowledged, can transform into the power to protect. The unconscious, when integrated, becomes not the enemy, but the foundation of consciousness itself. If we are to speak honestly, we must admit that the unconscious, once uncovered, is never fully tamed. To bring a desire into the light does not dissolve it. Rather, it alters the nature of its power. Awareness transforms compulsion into comprehension, but the drives remain. The instincts, those deep, timeless forces that pulse beneath our reasoning, do not vanish through understanding. What changes is the individual's relation to them. Once the unconscious content has been made conscious, the ego is no longer its captive. It becomes its interpreter. Freedom, in the psychoanalytic sense, is not the conquest of desire, but the reconciliation with it, to know that within us live the infant, the lover, the rebel, the destroyer, and to no longer fear their voices. You must understand that repression was never evil in itself. It was the price of civilization. Without repression, man would still be ruled entirely by instinct. The child who strikes in anger must be taught restraint. The youth whose passions burn without limit must learn sublimation. the transformation of raw instinct into form, art, or thought. Repression, therefore, is a necessary organ of psychic life. But like all organs, it can become diseased. When repression hardens into denial, when the ego becomes deaf to the murmur of its own depths, the instincts revolt. Then the unconscious, having been banished, returns disguised through neurosis, hysteria, obsession, anxiety. The repressed never dies. It only grows mythic. It is this mythic return that makes the human being both tragic and magnificent. In every act of art, in every creation of culture, the repressed libido seeks expression in sublimated form. The sculptor gives form to forbidden desire. The poet writes what the superego forbids him to speak. The saint transfigures erotic longing into spiritual devotion. In this sense, the history of humanity is the history of repressed desire transformed into beauty and meaning. Yet beneath every cathedral, every symphony, every moral code, lies the same eternal tension, the struggle between instinct and order. To understand this is to see that our failures, our repetitions, even our suffering, are not aberrations. They are the necessary costs of consciousness. But let us return to the phenomenon that began our inquiry. Why one continues to fall back into old patterns. At its core, this is a failure not of morality or intelligence, but of integration. The individual repeats the same emotional pattern because a fragment of the psyche remains frozen at the point of trauma. Time moves forward, but the unconscious does not recognize time. What was once unbearable remains unresolved, trapped like a splinter in the soul. The adult, who returns to toxic relationships or self-sabotaging behavior, is not weak. He is attempting to repair, through repetition, what was broken in childhood. But because the repair is sought unconsciously, it can never succeed. The same wound is reopened each time. Only through analysis, through the slow uncovering of the original conflict, can the repetition lose its power. Consider again the concept of transference, which I have called both the obstacle and the instrument of cure. In transference, the patient projects the unresolved figures of the past onto the present. The analyst becomes the parent, the lover, the rival. The emotional intensity that emerges is the very energy of the repressed, seeking recognition. When the patient experiences anger, love, or fear toward the analyst, these are not new emotions, they are the reenactment of ancient ones. The analytic space thus becomes a theater where the unconscious stages its hidden dramas. Through this repetition within the analytic frame, the patient can finally recognize the illusion that the danger, the longing, the guilt belong to the past. Recognition breaks the spell. The repetition, once conscious, can be relinquished. The unconscious mind, however, is never exhausted. It is creative, protean, and deceptive. Even as we illuminate one corner, shadows gather in another. Analysis is therefore not a one-time act, but a lifelong attitude, an openness to the movement of the psyche. Those who imagine that one can heal completely misunderstand the human condition. The psyche is not a wound to be closed, but a dynamic field of conflict and reconciliation. The goal is not permanent harmony, for that is death, but the capacity to bear inner tension without collapse. The mature ego is elastic. It can contain contradiction without splitting. It knows that love may contain hate, that purity conceals desire, that creation arises from destruction. This, I believe, is the highest form of maturity, to live without denial of the unconscious. The child represses because it must. The neurotic represses because he fears. The mature person integrates because he understands. He does not pretend that instinct is gone, nor does he surrender to it. He allows eros and thanatos to coexist, to balance one another. He creates, knowing that within creation lies destruction. And he loves, knowing that within love lies loss. Such a man or woman lives not as a slave to unconscious repetition, but as a participant in the eternal rhythm of psychic life. You see, repression is a kind of inner censorship, and censorship, by its nature, distorts the truth. The psyche, like a political state, becomes tyrannical when its censorship grows too severe. Under tyranny, the forbidden becomes seductive. The more one tries to suppress a thought, the stronger it becomes, for the energy of repression feeds it. This is why moral Puritans so often fall prey to the very impulses they condemn. Their psychic energy is monopolized by the battle against what they cannot accept within themselves. The cure for repression is not suppression but understanding. The moment one can say, "Yes, I am capable of this impulse, and I choose otherwise," the impulse loses its demonic character. Conscious choice transforms instinct into power. Dreams continue to serve as the purest revelation of this dynamic. In the dream, the censorship of the ego is relaxed, and desire emerges clothed in symbolism. Sexual energy may appear as climbing, fighting, or flying. Aggression may appear as pursuit, catastrophe, or storm. Each dream is a compromise between wish and defense, the id speaking through disguise, the ego maintaining its dignity through distortion. The analysis of dreams reveals not only the individual's repressed content, but the universality of human conflict. Every civilization dreams in similar forms, because the unconscious is older than culture. The serpent, the ocean, the mother, the fall. These archetypal images are the timeless language of repression and desire. They are not random illusions, but the collective poetry of the human soul. And yet, even as the unconscious speaks, few are willing to listen. To listen is dangerous, for it dismantles the illusions by which one sustains identity. The ego prefers the stability of ignorance to the instability of truth. This is why resistance is so powerful in analysis. The patient approaches the truth, then retreats. He finds reasons to doubt, to delay, to trivialize. The closer he comes to the repressed material, the greater the fear. For to uncover the unconscious is to question the foundation of the self. The ego is built upon selective amnesia. To remember what was forgotten is to threaten the structure. But this very fear is the sign that analysis is working. The resistance is the guardian of the threshold. Beyond it lies freedom. In my final reflections, I have come to view the analytic journey as a descent not unlike the myths of Orpheus or Theseus. One must venture into the labyrinth of the unconscious, guided by the thread of association, to confront the beast of repression. The minotaur one faces is not an external monster, but the disowned instinct, the anger, the lust, the grief that the ego cannot bear. To confront it without flinching is to reclaim its power. To flee from it is to remain forever haunted. The analyst is merely the companion on this descent, the one who holds the thread while the patient faces the dark. When the descent is complete, if it is ever truly complete, the patient does not emerge pure or unscarred. He emerges whole. He has seen his own depths and learned that what he feared was not evil but human. He has ceased to divide himself into saint and sinner, good and bad. He knows that morality without self-knowledge breeds cruelty. And that compassion begins with understanding one's own shadow. He no longer repeats unconsciously, for he no longer hides from himself. His desires are no longer enemies but allies. His guilt no longer a whip but a compass. He lives not in innocence but in authenticity. And this, perhaps, is the true meaning of psychoanalysis, not the cure of illness, but the restoration of truth. Every neurosis is a lie the self tells to avoid the unbearable. Every repression is a denial of life's complexity. To analyze is to replace illusion with knowledge, to replace compulsion with freedom. It is an arduous process, demanding patience, humility, and courage. Yet for those who dare to undertake it, the reward is immense. They cease to be victims of their own history. They cease to repeat. They become, at last, the conscious authors of their destiny. As I look upon the century that has unfolded since the birth of psychoanalysis, I see that humanity still struggles with the same conflicts that plagued the first patient who lay upon my couch. We have changed our costumes, or language, or gods, but not our psyche. The unconscious remains the true ruler of man. Technology has given him speed, comfort, and distraction, but it has not cured his inner division. The same forces, desire, guilt, repression still govern his relationships, his wars, his art, until man turns inward and faces the unconscious. He will remain at war with himself. Therefore, I say to you who study the mind, do not seek to abolish the unconscious, but to converse with it. Do not condemn desire, but understand it. Do not repress conflict, but listen to what it teaches. For in the heart of every repression lies the secret of creation, and in every repetition lies a message from the past asking to be heard. The task of psychoanalysis, and indeed, of all honest living, is to answer that message with awareness. Only then does the compulsion to repeat yield to the capacity to choose. In the final analysis, the human soul is not a battlefield to be conquered, but a dialogue to be sustained. The unconscious will always whisper, repression will always tempt, desire will always seek disguise. But through understanding, through the courage to know, one can transform fate into freedom. For the real reason you keep falling back into old patterns is not weakness, but ignorance of your own depths. And once you have seen those depths, once you have named the repressed desire and made peace with it, you no longer fall. You descend consciously. You no longer repeat. You remember. And in remembering, you become whole.